everyone. In this video we will consider how language is used by LGBT plus people, how language is used about LGBT plus people, and symbols related to sexuality. There is an overarching theme in everything we will consider, a theme of visibility and invisibility. It is fair to say that traditionally straight identities have been dominant in both everyday language and in media representations. It is also fair to say that non-straight identities have often been marginalised, discriminated against and made less visible through language and media representations. It is important to recognise the different processes through which this happens. Doing so reminds us that something that is not proactively prejudicial or discriminatory can still be problematic in the context of aiming for equality of different identities. There are three terms that are very useful to us when thinking about this. Homophobia, which is negative attitudes towards homosexual people and homosexuality, which may be manifested in discrimination, hostile behaviour, or hate crimes. Heterosexism, which is a system of power which privileges straight or heterosexual people. And heteronormativity, which is the belief that heterosexuality is the default and preferred sexuality. You're probably pretty clear on how homophobia turns up in language and images. Labels like dyke and faggot are clearly abusive when applied by straight people to lesbian, gay or bisexual people. They seek to attach negative connotations to the lesbian, gay or bisexual person. It's not quite so straightforward though. Language is dynamic. Such words are not always offensive and they are not always associated with negative connotations. In a challenge to homophobia and as an act of empowerment, people with the identities that such slurs are directed against reclaim them and define them with positive connotations in the way that they use them. For example, some lesbians use the word dyke to refer to other lesbians. I once saw a wonderful group of lesbian bikers on a pride parade who had named themselves Dykes on Bikes. This is actually an international organisation. And queer has been reclaimed and recast with positive connotations when used in slogans such as "We're here and we're queer." Perhaps even more empoweringly, queer has also been brought into regular use with entirely neutral connotations as an umbrella term for people with non-heterosexual and non-cisgender identities. The reason I say that this use of queer is perhaps even more empowering than uses of words with positive connotations is that it brings it into everyday use, which is arguably a step beyond campaigning discourse, which, while positive of course, still entails the identities being seen as different and having to campaign for visibility and recognition. Homophobic language use and other homophobic activities have been reducing in some societies over the past few decades, though it is important to recognise that this is not the case everywhere. Even where homophobia is reducing, there is still heterosexism and heteronormativity to deal with. Whereas we tend to think of homophobia as something individuals do, considering heterosexism reminds us that homophobia exists within and because of a system of power that privileges straight people and disempowers LGBT plus people. In relation to gender, sexism is widely used and understood in the same way. We can also clearly see parallels between this and the privilege and disempowerment relating to ethnicity and social class that we will be considering in later weeks. Heteronormativity is the most subtle of the three concepts we are considering here. It is so subtle sometimes that you don't even notice it, at least not if you're straight. Heteronormativity, as we have discovered, is the belief that heterosexuality is the default and therefore the preferred sexuality. It is clear to see how this unfounded belief would follow from a system of privilege. The media in all societies was in the past completely heteronormative. It was rare for LGBT plus people to be visible at all in TV and film. This is changing in many societies and a great deal in some. Again, however, it is important to recognise that the patterns we see in, for example, US and UK media, which we'll consider in our other video, are not replicated everywhere. Even where media systems are moving away from heterosexual identities being the only identities represented to a much more representative range of identities, the default part of the heteronormativity definition still stands. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about the word rom-com, for example. You probably know that it stands for romantic comedy. So what's your first thought or the image you conjure up when you hear or see the word rom-com? It is a story where a couple form a romantic attachment. That much is straightforward. However, the couple you imagine are probably young, probably beautiful in the stereotypical sense, probably American, and most definitely a woman and a man. We generally do not expect to see two women or two men form a romantic attachment in a rom-com unless it is specifically referred to as a gay rom-com or a queer rom-com. In other words, including a straight couple in a rom-com is the default position. The same happens in everyday interaction. I am gay, and before my wife and I got married, when I referred to my partner, when she wasn't there, in conversations with people I do not know, in service encounters, for example, the person I was having the conversation with almost always referred to my partner as he. They presumed I would have a male partner because I am a woman, and that is the default position. So, thinking about language, media and sexuality in terms of homophobia, heterosexism and heteronormativity is useful because it allows us to consider the nuance that exists in how we talk about and represent the diversity or otherwise of sexualities. Homophobic representations in the media are, in some societies, quite rare now, though they do still happen, and homophobic language use is reducing. Heteronormative media representations and uses of language are still prolific. They are reducing, but more slowly. And all of this is happening in the context of heterosexist societies. Many are becoming less so over time, but arguably there is no society yet that is not heterosexist. Now we're going to consider the rainbow flag. Probably the most well-known aspect of LGBT plus identity is the rainbow flag. It is useful to analyse the image and to consider the ways in which what it represents has changed over the decades and the implications of those changes for the message it communicates. As we already know, one of the key concepts to consider when thinking about representation is connotations. Let's think about what a rainbow out with the context of the rainbow flag connotes. A rainbow appears after rain, so it can be metaphorically, another representational concept, considered to communicate positivity after negativity. It's important to note that this could be culturally specific, however. I certainly view rainbows positively because I live in a country where it rains a lot. If I lived somewhere that was prone to drought, I might think differently. It might be rain rather than the rainbow that connoted positivity. Then again, I guess the rainbow would still be a nice marker of the fact that it had rained. What do you think? This reflection reminds us that the rainbow already exists in a code before it even becomes the rainbow flag, or perhaps it exists in different codes. Rainbows are also associated with variety and diversity. As children, in learning how to draw or paint rainbows, we are also implicitly learning about the colour spectrum, where each colour sits on it, how different colours mix with one another to create new colours, and so on. We learn phrases like all the colours of the rainbow and learn to understand them to mean everything or a great many things. It makes sense then that a rainbow would come to be associated with diversity, and in this context, particularly the diversity of identities of LGBT plus people. The rainbow flag is often talked about as the symbol of the LGBT plus community, but it wasn't always a symbol. Nothing is automatically a symbol for something else. That's because symbols become symbols due to convention. Some set of people agree that something is going to stand for something else, and if this is more widely adopted, the thing becomes a symbol. This is straightforward with more formal contexts like branding. A brand or an agency working on behalf of a brand decide on a logo for the brand and launch it. It didn't work like that for the rainbow flag. Initially, the rainbow flag was made for a specific event to serve a function. The event was the 1978 San Francisco Pride Parade, and the function was that there were flagpoles where the rally at the end of the parade would be held, the Civic Center Plaza in front of City Hall in San Francisco. So those organising the parade decided to make flags to hang from the flagpoles. It's as simple as that. If you Google who created the rainbow flag, you will discover the gay rights activist Gilbert Baker, pictured here on the left. But did you know that there's actually some controversy over this fact? Looking at it in terms of representation, we can say that this controversy revolves around the creation of the flag per se versus the development of the flag into a symbol. Decisions about the creation of the first flags for the 1978 San Francisco Pride Parade involved Lynn Segerblom, James McNamara, and, depending on who you ask, a number of other members of the Pride organising team. But it was Gilbert Baker who worked to take the flag beyond that initial event to become a symbol of the community. It's interesting too that the initial colours were not chosen to represent the different LGBT plus identities, but were chosen instead to represent characteristics of the community or the meaning associated with the community. Hot pink for sex, red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sunlight, green for nature, turquoise for magic or art, indigo for serenity, and violet for spirit. Over the years, the flag has developed, with some colours and shapes being removed, reinstated, or added. Sometimes this has been due simply to the availability of dyes to make the flags, but sometimes it has been a question of inclusion. While, as we've discussed, the original colours and the sets of colours following the various changes over the years did not each represent an identity, the flag as a whole came to be associated by some as only representing gay and lesbian people, and thus excluding those with other identities such as bisexual and transgender people. In addition, the flag was viewed by black and minority ethnic people as representing white gay and lesbian people. In response to these concerns, this progress flag was created. It integrates other flags and symbols which have developed over the years into the original Pride flag in order to be more inclusive. When the progress flag was widely adopted, there was backlash from some areas of the LGBT plus community who argued that ethnicity and gender are different from sexuality and that the flag should be about sexuality. What do you think? Does the ways that we have been exploring how different aspects of identity intersect with one another have something to add to that debate? I have a suggested research task for you now. This is voluntary, but it would certainly be interesting for you to explore. Here it is. It's all about the adoption of the rainbow symbol to represent the NHS during COVID. Pause the video here and work through it if you like. we've been considering visibility of LGBT plus people in visual representations. Now we're going to briefly focus on visibility and invisibility in language. Have you ever heard of polari? My guess is you haven't, but if you're LGBT plus and had been living 50 to 100 years ago, you might well have been speaking it with other LGBT plus people in public spaces. But why? Language is developed to fulfill purposes. That's why languages that are not used in specific contexts anymore, like Latin, tend to die out, and why there are often moves to reinvigorate languages by reintroducing them into the everyday context of more people, like Irish and Scottish Gaelic. It's stating the obvious to say that LGBT plus people do not live in LGBT plus only communes and never did. So how would a specific language develop for that community? Why was it needed? The community developed it proactively because they needed invisibility. Being in a same-sex relationship was illegal until 1967 in the rest of the UK and until 1982 in Northern Ireland. I know that sounds like ancient history to people of traditional student age, but for context, I was around in 1982. I was 10. So in the wider scheme of things, it's not so very long ago. As an aside, it's worth highlighting that being in a same-sex relationship was only ever criminalised if you were a man. That didn't mean that gay and bisexual women were embraced in society. What it meant was that gay and bisexual women were invisible in society. At a time when sexual relationships were constructed as being all about procreation, about creating the next generation, society seemed to not even be able to conceive of a relationship between two women being sexual at all. So women didn't face the physical oppression that men did, but they still faced a kind of symbolic oppression by being unseen. So anyway, back to polari. For safety, LGBT plus men needed to be able to communicate with one another in a way that police, etc. could not understand. And polari was adopted across the LGBT plus community for this purpose. It's a mixture of a range of different languages and codes. There's a lot of theatre slang in there, and a lot of it is developed from Romani languages that travellers used. It's interesting, I think, that so much of polari came from the languages of other oppressed groups. It's a very good thing that polari is no longer required in the UK. There might still be individuals and groups that do not embrace LGBT plus people, but broadly speaking, government and the legal system does recognise and embrace us now. However, a bit like what I was saying about proactive work being done to keep some minority languages alive, there's work being done to try to document polari as an important historical language in the history of our society, something that reminds us of a different time that we shouldn't forget, and which makes us appreciate the changes that many have made over the years to get us to the point where we are now. It's worth reflecting on the fact that while polari isn't required in the UK anymore, there are countries where same-sex relationships are still illegal and where it is dangerous for people to be LGBT+. Even here, things are changing slowly. On the flip side, from polari being used for invisibility, we can think about how LGBT+ people use language for visibility. I've already talked about one example of this, where people have reclaimed words that were previously used against our community with negative connotations to use them in a celebratory way and shift their connotations from negative to positive. Words like dyke, queer and queen. Another example of using language for visibility is something called gay voice. This is a type of speech that has, among other things, a lot of variation in intonation from higher to lower pitch and what is called sibilance on the S's. In everyday terms, we would call this sounding lispy. This sound is characteristically associated with gay men. Researchers like Ron Smith, Scott Kiesling and Arnold Zwicky have looked into both what gay voice is and why it happens. We can relate what they found to our discussions about nature and nurture and about structure, agency and performance. The use of gay voice seems to move in two directions. On the one hand, some speakers, particularly older speakers, have noticed themselves using it and tried to stop doing so because they want to make their LGBT plus identity less visible. Other speakers, particularly young speakers, proactively try to develop their use of gay voice and perform an LGBT plus identity by using it, among other things. This is a very good reminder that language is dynamic, it is context specific, and each user uses it for their own purposes. It's also important to remember that not every LGBT plus man uses gay voice or wants to use gay voice. The community is diverse. To put it very simply, there are gay men who do not sound gay and there are straight men who do sound gay in a stereotypical sense. You might also be thinking, well, what about the women? You probably recognise what researchers have identified as gay voice, that sing-songy, sort of lispy voice. Do you think there's anything similar used by LGBT plus women? The researchers don't think so. So why might that be? Arnold's Vicky thinks it's about differences in how gay women and gay men construct the LGBT plus aspect of their identities. He says that many gay women construct themselves as part of a community of women, whereas many gay men construct themselves by differentiating themselves from straight men. So it makes sense for gay men to develop a gay voice, and it doesn't make so much sense for gay women to develop a gay voice. It's an interesting analysis. What do you think? Well, that's us at the end of our video about language, image, visibility and invisibility. I hope you enjoyed exploring these issues with me. See you in the next video.